But for now, let's move to Freddy's presentation. Freddy will be providing us with a perspective from a civil society lens based on his extensive experience. Freddy, the floor is yours.
Okay, I stopped the technical side. Let me continue then. So thank you very much, Manuel. So thank you very much, Nicholas, for your presentation. And I find it very interesting, especially when you talk about the elite, the inclusion of the elite, the horizontal inclusion and the elite coming together and have their interests. So I think we can later discuss to what extent this actually allow inclusion of ideas and voices of different people at local level in terms of inclusive governance. So thank you very much. So as Manuel talked, I'm a practitioner, so I will be talking from a very practical perspective, things that I have seen on the ground, studies that I have conducted of some of the programs that I have managed. So I will talk from a civil society perspective, looking at what on effort to achieve greater and more inclusive decentralization. So I will start first looking at what do we mean by inclusive decentralization, because I think it's nice to clarify what I mean by that. So for me, when I talk about inclusive decentralization, first of all, is a requirement of sustainable development goals. It's something that local transparency is required to ensure that global and national development goals are achieved. And what is important as well is the existence of appropriate local participation and accountability mechanism, which allows citizens to be able to participate at subnational level. And participation is not only attending the public meetings, also attending any other local meetings, also about the possibility of influencing decisions. So, when you hear me talking about the inclusion participation, it's not about only sharing the ideas, but it goes beyond that, and it's also about influencing decision at local level. So, who is included and who is excluded around this discussion? This will just I finished to say. So once again, I will be talking more about inclusion in decision-making at local level. So at a decentralized subnational level, the inclusion of different groups, specifically marginalized group, because that's my specialty, and in decision-making, how they are included and how they are able to influence decision-making. But in talking about that, it's more about looking at what are the main political economy factors which are a barrier for this inclusion participation, but also at the end, talk about some of the lessons learned which allow for meaningful inclusion of people of marginalized groups, such as women and youth in decision-making. So, recently, before joining SNV in Mali, I was part of a small research team which was looking at social norms in governance, and especially looking at how social norms within the public authorities are actually hindering inclusive governance, inclusive decentralization, and local governance in general. And one of the political economy forces that right now I can identify is about social norms in governance, in local governance structures. And when we talk about social norms, it's mainly about the behavior and the rules and expectations in formal and informal structure. That are shared by the reference group. So the reference group could be local authorities, of a small group of people within local authorities, which actually influence how people behave within local government. So a simple example could be if we have a program on health, public health, or sexual reproduction. So how the public authorities view who has access to contraceptive, for example, who has access to certain medication, will influence who is included, who's excluded in decision making. And within the local government, you may have a specific group which actually reinforce those social norms and decide, and this influence the behavior on how public authorities include and exclude a certain group in society. We can even take beyond and talk about in Burundi, for example, a country that I've worked in. So some of the social norms you see, they are more on a political side. So they also decide which group gets included in decision making or not, based on political affiliation, political party, for example. So these are also, and within the public authorities, you have a reference group which is in charge of reinforcing those rules and regulations and dictate the behavior of public authorities. And what makes it work, and most of the time, is also the consequences of public authorities, of local officials who are not following those rules and regulations. And it could be sanctions, but also being rejected. It could also be physical to a certain extent. So social norms for me is something that I would like to bring here on the table, and I hope people can actually talk about it, because in many of the countries that I've worked in, this is something that I have seen. So I couldn't put a name on it until a few years ago, but there is a small research which was done by Care International in 2019, which looked at how social norms influence public authorities' behaviors and how those behaviors actually define and decide who is included, excluded in decision making, and this is quite interesting to look at some of those findings which are presented. So based on so these are a few examples that I have on social norms and how they influence public authorities, and these are the three aspects of inclusive decision making at a local level, and these are some of the examples you can actually see. So so the first one is about for public authorities, accounting to managers at senior level should take priority over accounting to citizens. So perfect example. I think it comes back to what Nicholas was saying, for example, when you actually mentioned that there is a political settlement of elite. One can question if we are talking, if in decentralization process, we are talking about downward accountability. And if you have this political settlement based on the elite, or you can ask yourself to whom are they accountable? The public authorities of, for example, are they accountable to the citizen, or are they accountable to the senior managers within the government? And you can then ask yourself to what extent this upward accountability towards the senior management is influencing who is included and who's excluded in decision making. Because so that's a question that one can ask himself. So, but also the evidence from citizen participation feedback is not necessarily an urgent priority requiring change programs or services. So this also, the level of who are you accountable to, either it is political accountability or bureaucratic accountability on a higher level, also define to what extent do you care about the feedback you receive from the citizen as the local government, or whether CSOs participate or not. It also influences how serious you take what they are saying, because at the end of the day, if they cannot punish you, or if they cannot put pressure on you, there's no need to feel that you need to respond to their feedback or their requirement. So this also influences responsiveness. And there is also, we often talk about inclusion decision making, but what we have seen in a few countries we have worked it for, this is result from Somalia, Burundi, and many other countries that are also in Mali to start with, is that public authorities tend to engage more able in easy accessible citizen, and they neglected the marginalized and excluded citizen. So, but this happens from So you have a civil society organization representing youth and women, for example, who participate in decision making. So again, here we need to question to what extent those who are participating in decision making are representative of a larger group. They may only be representing elite within that group, but it does not necessarily mean that they actually represent everyone within the women or the youth. So I remember asking a question in Somalia saying, okay, who are the women participating in decision making? Because I was interested to understand that. And I think the main answer that came out, some of them were teachers or nurses and those kind of things. So it actually pushed us to ask ourselves to what extent this participation of these elite women is actually representative of the larger issues of the women in society. So these are the few things, how these few social norms actually affect the inclusive governance process. So I have a few examples. Unfortunately, it was a picture and then I couldn't put it in in the presentation. So the research was conducted in 2019. So I have a few examples which can give you a clear idea of what we have seen on the ground. So inclusive governance, when we were talking with people in Somalia, Burundi, in Rwanda, and also some of my colleagues did it in Afghanistan, what we saw was that building in physical infrastructure takes priority over social infrastructure, for example. So public authority tends to favor things you can see with your eye, building markets, building roads, and then this takes the whole budget. So issues of inclusion, of participation are not really taken into consideration, neither budgeted for. And this is something we have seen across these different countries. And for us, it was defined as being a social norm that so public authorities prefer physical infrastructure rather than social ones. And the fact that inclusive governance, inclusive decentralization has been pushed by international donor organizations has also helped the situation, because when few of the people who were asked questions, was something that one of the norms that came out was that governments develop these inclusive governance processes and everything to actually respond to donor requirements. Therefore, it's not an issue of local government to actually put them in place. So the incentives is on different levels. So local government does not feel that they need actually to foster more accountability and transparency and inclusion, because it's more of a donor requirement, something in their way of working, for example. Okay. So it's also the other social norms that came out is political accountability, rewards given to, I think Nicholas, you talked about it, rewards given to voters. That's also something that came out. And what we see as well is that public authorities have all the power most of the time. That's what else that is interesting here that I can share. I think these are the few things that I can share the research for those who are interested to read it. But these are the few social norms that came out, which are explaining why some of the marginalized group or the behavior of public authorities which allow or hinder inclusion processes. So, so what can we do? So, what can we do to actually foster the participation of civil society organization in decision making, but also to ensure that local government decision making process are more inclusive and respond to the needs and the voices of the women, youth, and other marginalized people. So, I think one of the things that what I have seen in the program that have worked in general is that inclusive governance should be addressed systematically. So I think I have seen a few programs or focusing mainly on civil society organization or only on public authorities and all of that. But I think what we have seen in the past years is that addressing inclusive governance from a systemic perspective is more successful. This means that, of course, you empower marginalized group, you actually empower also build the capacity of public authorities, you engage in advocacy, and you also engage in former power holders, because they are the ones sometimes, in Somalia, for example, what we found out was that the public elected officials were more accountable to traditional power holders, either religious or others, and not necessarily downward accountability. So you need to see inclusive governance from a systemic perspective, and you have to work with different stakeholders and make sure that they are connected to be able to achieve it. The other thing is about addressing negative social norms, especially when it comes to women and youth. I think in most of the countries I've worked in, the 30% quotas which have been put in place are there. But obviously in some countries like Rwanda, it has yielded quite a number of women decision-making. And in Burundi as well, it's progressing well. In Somalia, still a little bit difficult. And so in Mali, the 30% are also in place, but you don't see a lot of women decision-making. So I think most of the research are looking at what are those social norms which guide society, which is like a mental frame of society, which have become a barrier for these women participation in governance processes. And these are the things we have seen as well in Burundi, for example, where I think in 2016 women were elected in the local government with 30%, but half a year later, when you go back, most of them have resigned, went back home. So the conclusion was in this research was about what do we need to do in terms of dealing with social norms and stigma in communities to allow a greater participation of youth and women decision making. So socioeconomic empowerment, I think the participation of civil society organizations, we need to be very clear, because most of the countries we work in, either they lack capacity or themselves as individuals, they are not really educated and strong enough to actually participate and negotiate decision making. So a socioeconomic empowerment approach is really needed to actually make sure that they can participate in decision making. So in Burundi, for example, the case that I know very good is that half of the women who have been elected at local level and are participating in decision making as the leaders and leading others in communities came from small women associations, which have been supported by NGOs, and so they have built the capacity of youth and women and connect them to governance processes. So the socioeconomic empowerment is quite important. And the other aspect is the strengthening the capability. So even if I'm talking from CSO's perspective, of course, but we have to acknowledge that the increase of governance is demand and supply. So so building the capability of public authorities is very important, but we should not be naive in thinking that once they have the capability, they will be more inclusive, and therefore local decision making at local level will be more responsive and everything. So we still have to keep in mind the other constraints within the institutions, again, whether the political accountability, other institutional constraints which do not allow them to be more responsive as they want. So again, the other thing that we actually need to do to ensure that there is an increased decentralization process is to work on both on supply and demand. So supply being local government and demand being civil society organizations. And it's something that I have been also in Mali that I'm trying to push for, that we do not only engage with the youth associations and civil society organizations to empower them and push them to be in decision making, while the public authorities lack the capacity, neither they are not aware of the need and the interest and how it should be done. So it's very important to work on both sides and supply and demand, and sometimes really and this is something that we have seen in past few years in other countries that works quite good. So another aspect, civil society organization, if I think you will agree with me, I think Nicholas, in Ghana as well, in many other African countries, we have a multitude of civil society organizations. And I think if we want them to have a say in decision making and participate meaningfully, it's very important to work on how they can become more of a collective actions and a solidarity between different civil society organizations to be able to participate in decision making. So you don't need 20 women associations participation at local level. You need more of a coalition and collective actions which make them more stronger to actually have a say in decision making. And democracy, decentralization are somehow relatively new things on many African countries that I've worked in. And then we need to work on normalizing the participation of the participation of marginalized group in decision making. And I think when I say normalizing is about what are the process we put in place to ensure that there is a dialogue between public authorities and marginalized group on services. And from that dialogue, obviously, you start normalizing the face and participation of marginalized group in governance processes. So one of the tools that has been widely used in many countries that I have also worked with, for example, is the social accountability tool for community scorecard, which allow this dialogue and open the space and normalize the participation in decision making. So the other aspect, I think I'm almost done. So countries, political settlement matters. So I think in countries where you have a very strong leadership, there is a strong leadership, you need to align with the government priorities and engage with higher level authorities if you want to change anything, especially when it comes to inclusive governance, because if I take the case of Ghana, if the accountability is upwards towards the senior or political member parties, if you only push civil society organizations to go to public local meetings and participate, there is a likely less chance that they will be able to actually meaningfully influence decision making. So what you need to do is also engage with the higher level, strategic level, public, in the national level, which can become champion and open the door for change. So an example that I have here is while working in Rwanda, we actually I worked there for 3 years and realized that pushing for a participation at local level, yes, you had the numbers in terms of participation of women, but it was important to look at what are those barriers which do not allow a greater participation, meaningful participation. And one of the issues was that the planning process did not allow it because it was too short and did not allow people to participate. So you can continue pushing for participation and inclusion, but it won't work. So what we did was to engage with the higher level government officials to say, okay, this is what we found out, and this needs to change. And I think by the time I left, there was a discussion to see how this can be adjusted to allow more participation, meaningful inclusion decision making. So the last part that I would like to emphasize on, I think it joins what Nicola said, is about, I think, either for public authorities or civil society organization, when we are talking about inclusive decentralization process, we actually really need to understand the initial context and motivation behind decentralization process to start with. And if we do not understand that, it becomes rather technical work where we just look at the processes and we say, okay, you need to include people here and there, but the meaningful inclusion is not going to be possible. So why did decentralization took place? And what are the motivation behind it? And that's very important to understand in order to define how inclusion is going to work and what needs to change. But also, what are the key actors? The incentives behind the key actors. It could be politicians, in case you have elections at local level, for example, bureaucrats and citizens to start with. So the incentives that actually influence the behavior on including, excluding certain people in decision making. And what I would like to emphasize is that politics matter, and that sometimes we shy away of it, but we actually need to understand the incentives and the politics and everything around it in order to actually talk about meaningful inclusion. And also the last part of that, role of development partners in the whole process. I think we all have different agendas, we all different way of approaching inclusion processes, but I think it's very important to actually have a conversation. If I look at Mali, for example, and look at different donor interventions on the issues of inclusion, I think we all mean the same thing, but we do it in different ways. And it's very important to have this conversation on, after you have a look at motivation, the politics and everything, how we, the international development partners, are actually contributing individually as collectively to reform and have inclusive decentralization process at local level. So this was my short contribution to this discussion. So thank you very much for your attention.